A second type of macromolecule we're going to talk about are called lipids. Now, lipids, you may not be familiar with that term, but I think the more common name everybody's familiar with, which is fats. So, everybody's familiar with don't eat too many fats in your diet or don't eat too many carbs. Well, right now we're specifically going to talk about the fats, which scientists typically call lipids. Now, one thing I really want you to understand and to grasp is that lipids are the only class of large biological molecule that does not consist of polymers. So we're talking about 4 macromolecules here: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Lipids are the only one that do not form those polymers we talked about in the last part. And they share this common trait of being hydrophobic. Now, I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with that term, but let's break it apart and figure out what it means. And again, this is going to be a really important term for you to grasp for this entire class. So hydrophobic, if we break that apart, hydro means water, and phobic means fearing. So that means that we have something that's afraid of water. So lipids are hydrophobic. They don't like to interact with water, which makes sense. If you take some olive oil and you put it in water, it's going to separate and you're going to get that distinct layering look. Lipids are commonly composed of glycerol, which glycerol is just an alcohol with 3 carbons, and 3 fatty acids. And this is another reason sometimes you may. And so here's that picture or an illustration of a lipid or a triglyceride. So again, on the left side of the screen, you have the glycerol head, and then coming off of that, you have 3 fatty acid tails. So lipids have fatty acid tails, and it says here, fatty acids vary in the length and number and locations of double bonds they contain. So what we're talking about here is that in some lipids, in their fatty acid tails, we may only have single bonds, but in others we're going to have double bonds. And that's important when you talk about the difference between a saturated fatty acid and an unsaturated fatty acid. So in saturated fatty acids, we have the maximum number of hydrogen atoms possible, and they don't have any double bonds. In unsaturated fatty acids, we have 1 or more double bonds. So you may have heard on television or read in a magazine that you want to make sure you're eating unsaturated fatty acids. Maybe you didn't know why, but we'll explain kind of the biology behind that in just a second. So here's an illustration of a saturated fatty acid and an unsaturated. Well, we said that the saturated fatty acids are completely surrounded by hydrogens, and there's no double bonds in them, which in this example they're using butter. And if you look at the molecular structure of butter, you can see that it's just kind of a linear shape. There's no kinks in it. It's just really compact and straight. Now let's go to the other picture and let's look at this example of olive oil. What we see here is that this is an unsaturated fatty acid, and if we look at the molecular diagram, we see that it's got a kink in it, and that kink that's in it is representing a double bond. Here's a more of a characteristic illustration of a saturated versus unsaturated fatty acid. But again, we have that glycerol head, and then we have the 3 fatty acid tails that are hanging off of it. In a saturated fat, you don't have any double bonds, therefore you're not getting any kinks in those fatty acid tails. But in our unsaturated fats, we're getting some double bonds that are occurring. And if you think about, what is this doing to your body? Well, if you're eating saturated fats, okay, they're going to be able to kind of pack together a lot tighter because they don't have those double bonds. So that's where you're going to get things like clotting and really fatty deposits that are going to be hard to get rid of. And that's why they encourage people to eat unsaturated fats, because those kinks or those double bonds allow it to pass through the body more easily. Now, another type of lipid we're gonna talk about is called a phospholipid. And phospholipids are really important to all living organisms. It says phospholipids have only 2 fatty acid tails. they have a phosphate group instead of a third fatty acid. So phospholipids are going to be shaped just a little bit differently. And in terms of their structure, phospholipids are going to have something called a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail. Well, we just mentioned that hydrophobic means afraid of water. So that means that the tails on these phospholipids are not going to want to come into contact with water. However, we have this other term. It's a new one. Hydrophilic. Hydrophilic means water loving, or they don't mind that they come into contact with water. So the heads on these phospholipids can be exposed to water and they don't have a problem with it. And what happens is that we get kind of this bilayer that forms between the heads and the tails of these phospholipids. And that's going to be really important because phospholipids are found within the cell membranes of all living organisms. And we're going to look at a picture of that. So here's kind of a cartoon of a phospholipid. Again, you have that kind of phosphate glycerol head, except for unlike normal lipids, you only have 2 fatty acid tails. Now here's that illustration I was trying to describe earlier, and it might help for you to look at this picture and then go back in your notes and read that slide again so that you can kind of visualize what's going on. But we said that in a phospholipid we have a hydrophilic head, and you see that these gray circles are representing those hydrophilic heads. And then our tails were hydrophobic. So what happens is that they're naturally going to kind of orient themselves in this fashion where we have one set of phospholipids on one side of the membrane and then another set on the other side of the membrane. And those tails are always going to want to stay away from the water. And this arrangement is what kind of makes up our biological membranes. Now, steroids are another type of lipid, and I think we've all heard of steroids, and we all kind of have a vision in our heads of what we think of when we mention steroids. But steroids are lipids, again, that are going to be characterized by a carbon skeleton consisting of 4 fused rings. So here's kind of a visual illustration of what a steroid is. But one steroid that's pretty common and that causes problems in people is cholesterol. So we can find this in our cell membranes. It can be a precursor for some hormones. But I just want you to be familiar that steroids are a type of lipid.